Good evening, grade 12. Hope you guys have been well. Our topic for today is going to be about sexual reproduction in plants. So we'll finish with sexual reproduction in humans, and now we'll talk about how it's done inside plants. For most of you guys, this should be a familiar topic. I'm pretty sure most of you guys might be aware of different parts of the flower and how each part of the flower basically plays a role in bringing about the reproduction of a plant. But here's an overview of our lesson today. All of this information can be found on page 185. Like I said earlier, we're going to be talking about the parts of the flower and their functions. We're going to be talking about two types of pollination, which is going to be cross-pollination, self-pollination. Uh, we're also going to talk about the different adaptations that flowers have for pollination. Okay, some plants they're going to use wind pollination. Other plants they're going to use cross pollination. Okay, so depending on what type of pollination it's going to use, their flower is going to have a certain design or a certain different adaptations that's going to help it to perform that function. And in a later video, we'll talk about fertilization as well as fruit and seed dispersal. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so first we're going to talk about the different parts of a flower as well as the function of a flower. Okay, so a flower is basically the reproductive organ of a plant. Okay, so this is basically a plant's equivalent of its sexual reproductive organs. Okay, a flower is going to have a number of basic parts. It's going to have petals, it's going to have a pistil, it's going to have a stamen, it's also going to have a stem and a sepal. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the petal. The main function of the petal is to attract insects or pollinating insects. Okay, so this is the reason why petals are going to have vibrant colors, such as red, yellow, blue, purple, etc. The reason why it has these vibrant colors is to attract different insects. Okay, in addition to having vibrant colors, petals also sometimes will have a certain smell that is going to further attract different insects. So it's going to have an aroma, and that's going to attract insects to the plant. Now, the reason why that's useful is because remember we said that the main function of a flower is to help it to reproduce. Okay, so sometimes flowers they need an insect to help them to pollinate themselves. Later on, we'll talk about what pollination is. But the petal is basically going to help, this plant to reproduce by attracting these pollinating insects. Okay, the next part we're going to talk about is the pistil. Okay, the pistil is the female reproductive part of a flower. Okay, so the same way how, in animals, the female reproductive part or the female reproductive system is going to have ovaries and ovules inside of it. Ovules or egg cells inside of it. It's going to be the same thing for the plants. Okay, so the pistil is going to have the ovary and the ovule inside of it. This is why we call it the female reproductive part of the flower, because this is where you're going to find the egg cells. In addition to the ovary and the ovule, you also have the stigma and the style. Okay, the stigma is found at the top of the pistil. The function of the stigma is basically to trap pollen grains. Okay, so the stigma is going to secrete some type of sticky substance, and whenever a pollen grain is flying by, or whenever an insect has a pollen grain on it and it brushes up against the stigma, that sticky substance on the stigma is going to cause the pollen grain to get stuck to it. Okay, the pollen grain basically is going to contain the male sex cell. Okay, so once the stigma traps this pollen grain, the pollen grain is going to go over a number of different changes, but we'll talk about that in a later video. Okay, next there's the style, which is just basically the neck of the pistil. Okay, so once the stigma uh, traps a pollen grain, that pollen grain will grow a tube, and that's going to grow down the style until it reaches the ovary and the ovules. But we'll, I guess, elaborate more on that in our second video when we talk about fertilization. Okay, so that's it for the female part of the flower called the pistil. Next, you have the stamen. Okay, so the stamen is the male part of the flower. Okay, there's two main parts of the stamen. You have the anther, which is going to create and hold the pollen grains. And you have the filament that basically supports the anther. It's going to suspend it into the air so that it'll come into contact with some type of insect, or so that whenever the wind blows, the pollen grains inside the anther will be able to blow away. Okay, so with the stamen, this is the male part of the flower once again. I guess to help you guys remember that, stamen has the word men inside of it. So that should help you to remember that this is going to be the male part of the flower. And this is what's going to create the pollen grain. Now, pollen grain is the male sex cell inside plants. Okay, so this is basically plants equivalent of sperm cells. The same way how, you know, we have, well, with our gamete cells, you know, gamete cells have haploid nucleus. Well, the pollen grains, they're gonna have that male nucleus inside of it. And the ovaries or the ovules, they're gonna have the female gamete or female nucleus inside of it. So the whole purpose of this flower really, when it comes to reproduction, is to somehow get this pollen grain by the anther to fall on top of this stigma. That's going to grow a tube, and then it's going to fertilize the ovule. So that will allow the male sex cell or the pollen grain to fuse with the female sex cell or the ovules. The same way how reproduction happens inside of, you know, animals or inside of us. An egg cell and a sperm cell is going to fuse. With a plant, you have the male nucleus inside a pollen grain fusing with the ovule, which has the female nucleus. Okay, next you have the sepal, which is just basically a leaf-like attachment found at the base of the flower. One of the functions it has is to basically protect the flower while it's growing or developing. And then you're gonna have the stem, also sometimes called a stalk. And the only thing the stem is doing is basically it's supporting the weight of the flower. It's gonna help to suspend it into the air, basically. Okay, some other adaptations of flowers is that flowers sometimes are going to create nectar, and that nectar is going to attract insects. So this is why you find a lot of bees and different stuff like that always flying around flowers. It's because they feed on the nectar, and that nectar is basically there to attract insects so that they will help the plants to pollinate. Okay, so here's a review of everything we talked about so far. The function of the flower, like I said, is the sexual reproductive organ of a plant. It can help the flower to reproduce sexually as well as asexually. Now, with the asexual reproduction in flowers, some of them can't self-pollinate. Remember, the definition of asexual reproduction is basically you have one parent that is going to reproduce, whereas with sexual reproduction, you have two parents. You can have a male and a female. So flowers basically have the ability to do both, okay? In the event where, I guess, a pollen grain is going to travel from one flower and land onto the stigma of another flower, that's going to be cross-pollination. That's going to be sexual reproduction, because now you are involving two parents, the male part of this flower and the female part of another flower. Or another scenario that might take place is self-pollination, where the pollen grain of this plant here might land on the same flower of the same plant. And in that case, you only have one parent involved inside this reproductive act. So we'll call that asexual reproduction. Okay, so moving on with, I guess, a summary of what we learned so far. Here are some of the parts of the flower. You have the stamen. Remember I said the stamen was the male part of the flower. You're going to find the anther, which creates the pollen grain, and the filament that's going to suspend that anther into the air so that it can come into contact with some type of insect, or so that the wind would be able to blow the pollen grains off of that anther. Okay, so that's this part right there, the filament and the anther. Next, you have the pistil. Once again, this is the female part of the flower. This is where you're going to find the stigma, which secretes a sticky substance to trap pollen grains to the top of the pistil. The style, which is the neck of the pistil, and you'll also find the ovaries and the ovules. Next, we have the sepal. Like I said, the leaf-like attachment at the bottom of the flower. It's going to protect the flower as it grows. Next, we have the petal. Like I said, it attracts insects with its color and smell. And then you have the stem, or the flower stalk, which is just basically holding up the flower. Okay, so here's a little diagram here that you can use to help test yourself to see if you can remember the different parts of the flower. So you can pause the video, for a second, and see if you can list off the different parts of a flower. All right, so next we're going to talk about pollination. What is pollination? Pollination is the transfer of a pollen grain onto the stigma of a flower. Okay, so the pollination is just a pollen grain traveling to the stigma of a flower. Now, when it comes to pollination, there's two ways that pollination can occur. It can either be self-pollination, where the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of that same flower, or it can be cross-pollination, which is going to involve two flowers. So the pollen grain is going to move from the anther of one flower and land on the stigma of another flower. Now, you also have something called pollinating agents, okay, such as a bee. Okay, so in the case where an insect is used, that's called insect pollination. Now, when we say a pollinating agent, this is just basically the means by which this pollen grain is going to travel. Okay, so when it comes to different ways that pollination is going to occur, you have insect pollination and you also have wind pollination. Okay, and as the name implies, basically an insect is going to travel with this pollen grain attached to it, and it's going to basically brush that up against the stigma, and that's going to help this pollen grain to travel from one plant to the next. In the case with cross-pollination, in the case of wind pollination, wind is going to be the pollinating agent, and that's going to cause this pollen grain to blow from one flower to the next. So it's going to move from this anther and land onto the stigma of another flower. Okay, so to recall what I said so far, pollination is the transfer of a pollen from the anther to the stigma of another of a flower. Pollination is the transfer of a pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of a flower. You have two types of pollination. You have self-pollination and you have cross-pollination. And you also have different types of pollinating agents. Okay, you can have insects, which are used inside insect pollination. You have wind pollination, where wind is going to cause this pollen grain to travel. Sometimes birds can also be pollinating agents, such as hummingbirds, for example, that feed on the nectar of plants. Okay, so with insect pollination, remember I said that, you know, sometimes certain flowers, they're going to secrete some type of nectar. That nectar is there to basically attract the insects. The insects are going to come to the flower and try to feed on that nectar. Now, during that process, pollen grains will be transferred or will basically stick to the insect. And whenever that insect travels to another flower, that's going to cause, you know, that's basically going to cause pollination, because now you have an insect that's carrying the pollen grain from one plant to the next. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the adaptation that plants have in order to bring about pollination. Okay, uh, like I said earlier, two methods used by plants to pollinate is one, you have wind pollination, and two, you have insect pollination. Okay, and when it comes to the adaptations that plants are going to have for pollinating, basically, this is going to be the different ways that plants have modified, you know, parts of their flower to make it more efficient or effective at carrying out pollination. Okay, so it's the same way how different cells inside of our body, you know, they're going to have specific adaptations to help them to carry out their job. For example, with the red blood cell, you know, red blood cells, they have hemoglobins inside of them. Okay, that's going to help it to carry oxygen around the body. Or with the lungs, remember the lungs, it has a certain design that's going to make it more efficient at absorbing oxygen. For example, you know that the alveoli found inside the lungs is where gas exchange is going to happen. Okay, so the same way how, you know, different parts of our body or different cells inside our body have adaptations to help them to perform a job, it's going to be the same thing with plants. Different parts of its flower is going to be modified in order to help it to achieve pollination. Okay, so that being said, not every flower is going to look the same. And we'll talk more about that as I move on to wind pollination. Okay, so with this, with wind pollination, the main way that these flowers are going to pollinate themselves is with the assistance of wind. So in this scenario, wind is going to be the pollinating agent, okay? Now, here's a picture over here of a common flower. When we think of a flower, this is the, I guess, the image most of us get inside of our head, but not every flower is going to look the same. And the reason why not every flower is going to look the same is because certain plants, they have evolved, or I guess come up with an adaptation that's going to make it, they have evolved to basically focus on one type of pollination. Either it's going to do wind pollination or it's going to do insect pollination. Okay, so with certain species of plants, their flowers are going to be focused on carrying out wind pollination. Okay, so with those flowers, they're going to look a little bit differently. All right, the different parts of this flower are going to have are going to be modified in a certain way so that so to make it more effective at carrying out wind pollination. Okay, so for example, if a plant was going to rely solely on wind to help itself to pollinate, then it's not going to need petals. Okay, so with plants that do wind pollination, their flowers are going to have very small leaves. The leaves are going to be inconspicuous. Now, what inconspicuous means is that it's not noticeable. Okay, so when you look at a typical flower, the petals might have, you know, a vibrant color. However, With wind pollinating plants, when you look at their flowers are not going to have any elaborate color. Sometimes the flowers or the petals are just green. They just look like leaves. Also, these petals are not going to have some type of smell that's going to attract insects. Okay? The reason why that happens is because this flower is doing wind pollination. So it doesn't need uh, vibrant, attractive colors because it's not trying to attract insects towards it. It's just going to rely on the wind. Okay? So that's the first adaptation of wind pollinating plants. Their flowers are very small and they are not noticeable. They're also not going to have some type of scent. And in addition to that, you're not going to find any nectar on these plants. Because once again, with wind pollinating plants, they rely on the wind to help their pollen grains to travel. They're not trying to attract any insects, so it doesn't need petals with vibrant colors. Okay, the next modification found on wind pollinating plants is that the anther or the stamen is going to have a certain structure. It's going to be very, very large and long, okay? So the pistil is going to be very long, and the reason why the pistil is very long is so that it can hold up the anther so that it'll be exposed to the wind as it passes by, okay? So the anthers are going to be exposed to basically make it easier for wind to blow pollen grains off of the flower. In addition to that, the pollen grains found on the anther are also going to be a little bit more different. They're going to be very small and light. The reason why they're small and light is so that whenever the wind blows, these pollen grains will be able to easily travel in the wind so that it can travel to a next flower. All right, so far we talked about the petals, the modification of the petals, the stamen, as well as the pollen grains. Next, we're going to talk about the modification of the stigma. Okay, the stigma is basically going to be very large as well. They're going to hang outside of the flower, the same way how the stamen is, long and large and hanging outside of the flower. The stigma, in addition to being long, is also going to have a feather-like design to basically trap the pollen grains outside of the wind or inside of the air. Okay, so you can kind of think of it as filtering out these pollen grains. All right, so those are the modifications of the stigma. It's going to be very long. It has a feather-like design, and that is going to help it to trap these pollen grains out of the air as the pollen grains travel inside of the wind. Okay, so going back to this image here, this image over here is basically an example of wind pollination. You have the pollen grains that's basically detaching from the plant, and they are very light. Okay, so that basically makes it easier for them to float in the air. All right, next we're going to talk about insect pollination. All right, so in the same way how, with wind pollination, different parts of the flower are going to have a certain type of modification to help it to, pollinate itself. Now, with plants that are going to rely solely on insect pollination, different parts of that flower is going to have, specific adaptations. So, for example, when it comes to the petals, these are going to be the plants that you'll expect to have all of the bright, vibrant colors when it comes to their petals. So colors such as yellow, blue, red, basically any vibrant color that's going to attract an insect. In addition to that, these flowers are also going to have an aroma or a scent that's also going to help to lure in these insects. Also, these flowers are also going to create nectar. Okay, so nectar, a lot of insects are going to be attracted to that nectar because that nectar is a source of food for them. Okay, so basically what's happening is you have a plant that's trying its best to attract insects towards it. The petals are going to be the first thing that catches the insect's attention. Next, or it could be a combination of the petal, the side of the petals, as well as the smell, you know, that the flower is giving off. Okay, and in addition to that, this flower is going to be creating nectar. Okay, so the bee, for example, is going to be attracted to this nectar so that it can feed on it. All right. So now that the plant has, you know, attracted this insect, it's going to have a number of other adaptations to make sure that insect is going to carry its pollen grain. Okay, so we'll talk about the stamen first. Remember, the stamen is the male part of the flower. This is where you're going to find the anther that contains the pollen grain. Now, with insect pollinating flowers, you will find that the stamen inside these plants are very short. They're going to be basically inside of the flower. Okay, remember with wind pollinated flowers, the stamen was very long and it was hanging outside of the flower. Okay, but in the case with insect pollinated flowers, the stamen is going to be shorter and basically it's going to be inside of the flower. Okay, so in order for this insect to get the nectar that it's trying to feed on, it's going to have to brush up against the stamen. Once this insect brush up against the stamen, the pollen grain inside of the anthers is going to stick to the insect. Okay, so this is another modification or adaptation. The pollen grain inside insect pollinated flowers are going to be very sticky. Okay, so if you look at this little clip right here, you see that the pollen grains is literally sticking to the insect. All right, the insect also has these little, you know, tiny hairs inside of it that's basically going to, I guess, uh, trap these pollen grains because these pollen grains are very sticky. Okay, so if this insect wants to feed on the nectar of this flower, it's going to be covered with this pollen grain. Okay, so whenever this insect now travels to another flower so that it can eat on more nectar, it's going to brush up into the stigma. And that's going to be the last modification we're going to talk about. The stigma is also going to be very short. It's going to be close to the nectar as well, so that whenever this bee lands on a plant and it's trying to feed on the nectar, that the pollen grains on this bee is going to be transferred to the stigma. And that is going to cause pollination to occur. Because remember I said that pollination is the transfer of a pollen grain from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the flower. Okay, so at this point, the plant is going to achieve pollination. All right, so here's a summary of the different pollinating or pollination adaptations that you find inside the flowers of plants. So with wind pollinated flowers, remember we said that the flower is going to be very small and inconspicuous. So like I said, inconspicuous basically means that it's not noticeable. Okay, so the petals are going to be very small. They're not going to have any vibrant color. They're probably just going to be green. They're not going to have any smell. So that's what inconspicuous means. It means that this flower is not going to be noticeable. When it comes to insect pollinating flowers, on the other hand, the flowers that you find are going to be very large and very conspicuous. So conspicuous means it's noticeable. Okay, so with these flowers, they're going to be very large. They're going to be brightly colored. And the petals are also going to have a scent. You will also find nectar inside these flowers as well. So the action of all those different features is that it's going to attract insect, which is what you would want in the case of insect pollinating flowers. Okay, next we'll talk about the pollen grains. Like I said, with the wind pollinated flowers, these pollen grains, they're going to be very small and smooth, so that's going to help them to travel in the air. In addition to that, you'll also have a larger number of pollen grains being produced. Okay, so that's basically going to help to increase the chances of pollination by occurring, because if you have more pollen grains traveling inside the wind, that's going to increase the chances of that pollen, landing on another flower of the same species. Okay, now when it comes to the insect pollinated flower, if you can remember that video or that little clip that I was showing you, the pollen grains of insect pollinating plants are going to be very sticky. Okay, so that's why you basically see all these little pollen grains that are sticking to this bee hair. Okay, next we're going to talk about the stamen with wind pollinated flowers. Remember we said that the stamen is going to be very long and it's going to basically hang outside of the flower. Okay, so here's a picture of that. Like I said, the stamen is very long and it's hanging outside of the flower. Same thing with the stigma. The stigma is also very long and feather-like, and it's hanging outside of the flower. Now, the reason why the filament of the stamens are so large or long is because it's going to put the anther that has the pollen grains basically in contact with the wind, so that whenever the wind blows, that pollen grain is going to be easily be able to be blown away. Now, with the insect pollinated flower, remember I said that in this scenario, the stamens are going to be very short. Okay, and you're also going to find them inside of the flower. Okay, and the reason why that happens is because with insect pollinating plants, they're basically trying to arrange their stamen as well as their pistil in the path that a insect is going to travel as it tries to get the nectar. Okay, so this insect isn't actively trying to pollinate the plant. The insect is just trying to feed on nectar. And as it flies inside of the flower, it's going to come into contact with the stamen as well as the stigma. Okay, so that's basically going to cause this insect to be covered with the pollen grains, and that's going to, help it to self-pollinate. Okay, let's see. When it comes to the stigma of wind-pollinated plants, like I said, they're very large, they're branched, and they are feathery, and they also hang outside of the flower. The reason why that happens is to increase the chances of it catching a pollen grain. And like I said earlier, with the insect pollinated flower, the stigmas are going to be flat. They're going to be very close to where the nectar is, so that whenever an insect tries to feed on the nectar, some of that pollen grain on the insect is going to brush onto the stigma, and that is going to allow pollination to occur, which will then lead on to fertilization. Okay, so an example of a wind-pollinated flower, you have an hibiscus. With an insect-pollinated flower, you have a Orchinia. Okay, so that's it for our video here. And here are some questions that you guys can use to practice. So I'll give you guys some time to, I guess, pause the video and look at the questions and attempt to answer them yourselves. And then I'll give you, the answer to these questions at the end of the video. Okay, so you can pause the video now and see if you could, answer each of these questions here. With an exception to C, because we haven't talked about fertilization yet. Okay, so I'll give you guys the answer now. A is the stigma, B is the anther, C is the ovary. Inside of the ovary, you can see these ovules here, but this line right there is just pointing to the ovary. Okay, so this is the ovary, and these right there inside of it are the ovules. In the next video, we'll talk more about the ovary and the ovules, as well as fertilization. Okay, so he says, state two features shown in a diagram which suggest that it is an insect pollinated flower. Okay, so two features shown in this diagram here is, remember we said with insect pollinating flowers, the flower is very conspicuous. Okay, so these petals are going to be large. And that's what you see in this picture here. The petals are very large. All right, another feature that shows that this is an insect pollinated plant is, remember we said that with insect pollinated plants, you're going to find the stamen and the pistil inside of the flower. With wind pollinated plants, you're going to find the stamen and the stigma outside of the flower. So they're going to be much larger and longer so that it can hang outside of the petals. But with an insect pollinated flower, you're going to find the stigma and the stamen inside of the flower. Okay, so those are two features. The flower petals are very large and conspicuous, and you also find the stigma and the the stigma and the stamen inside of the flower. All right, so moving on to the next question. List two other features of an insect pollinated flower not shown in the diagram. All right, so for two other features that you could say with this insect pollinated flower that are not shown, for one, the petals aren't colored. So, you know, that's another feature that you find inside insect pollinated flowers. And you can also say that the stamen is long. Okay, usually with insect pollinated flowers, the stamen is going to be very short. So those are two features that this picture here doesn't show. All right, now let's see. For the questions to the bottom there, I'll just answer them for you. But we'll basically talk more about this in our next video. But let's see. Name the structure which will become the fruit. The ovary of a flower is the part of that the flower that is going to become the fruit. And the ovules that are inside the ovary, which you basically see here, those are the parts of the flower that are going to become the seeds. All right, so that's it for my video for today.